Okay, while I share my screen, I just want to highlight something. It should pop up in your um, timetable, in your personalized timetable. But if not, just be aware of the fact that the last week of the semester. Let me just switch on some light. Okay. The last week of the semester, we will not have an online lecture and we will not have seminars. The reason for that is that the last week is Car Friday, Good Friday, sorry, Car Friday is the German name, Good Friday, which is a holiday, so there's no work. The university will not be open and there will be no seminars. So now the university decided that instead of the online lecture and the seminars, we have a 2-hour lecture on Thursday from 9 to 11 a.m. I'm not super happy with this decision, but I was told basically in not uncertain terms that there's nothing I can do about it and there's no other solution. We have a legal obligation to have a certain amount of contact hours with you guys. And so we will do that. I have to think a little bit. It just reached me. I have to think a little bit about whether I also record some stuff additionally or not, how to best do that, so to ensure that everyone gets the information they need. We might have what used to be called lecture capture. We might have just the recording of what is happening in the room that day. It's been so long that I actually did that and I have to kind of investigate. But just so that you know, last week we have an online lecture. We have no online lecture, no seminars, but we have a 9 to 11 in-person meeting. And I think I would also take that opportunity to then have Trudy and Lauren, our head of the department, and the program director come along and give the group that won the Rising Star, Social Rising Star awards, their awards. So that's kind of nice. We can do that in person. So there's a little something to that. Okay. With that being out of the way, I just want to kind of highlight, we talk about intergroup behavior this week. One of the most pervasive effects in social psychology, in psychology in general, being human means automatically sorting oneself in a group, in others, in another group, and favoring one group over the other. What we want to do today is to look a little bit closer of not just the effects that it has, but also why we have these tendencies, how far-reaching these tendencies are, and what we can do to help us better understand that. Okay. I think we talked a little bit about this, and I'm just like, I feel a little bit like almost uncomfortable talking about this now with the kind of context of this weekend. But we talked a little bit about group behavior when we talked about Sarah Everhart's murder, and we kind of highlighted that a lot of discussion around the trial, about the case, was centered around basically that she was a woman and the killer was a man, and that this was kind of like a men versus women. I think last week someone an MP in Parliament said that if a man kills a woman, then we should punish them more harshly than if they just kill a man. So it seems like there's something about, like in her arguments, that basically killing a woman is something worse than killing a man, and especially if a man kills a woman. So if there's some kind of group transgression, right? And in some ways, this is all immediately kind of puts me in one group, most of you in another group. And here you can see this kind of tendency to sort the world in these groups and then kind of favor one's in group here in a very drastic sense, and kind of have a little bit of out-group hate. We talk about this later for the other group. We also talked about this when it comes to racism, right? I think I just don't, I wouldn't like to elaborate what I said in the first session here on that slide, but I just want to highlight that, I mean, last week we talked about this attitude that we have, right? This kind of implicit and explicit attitudes that we have often to, like a positive one to members of our own ethnicity and our own race, and then more negatively towards members of outgroups, of members of groups who have a different ethnicity or a different from a different race. So this seems to be something, if we want to understand racism, if we want to study and better understand why people have these negative implicit and explicit prejudice and attitudes towards others, then we need to understand what it does to us if we sort a person in one group or the other. And this is what we're going to do today. I'm sorry. So what is a group? I don't want to, as you might have known by now, I'm not a huge fan of definitions. I think, as you can see, is another definition where you feel like, I'm not quite sure what that definition should give me. Most of psychologists, of social psychologists, would define a group as 3 or more people. So one person obviously is not a group, 2 people are a dyad, a couple, a pair, and then 3 and more are a group, right? But in order to make it a group, it's not just 3 people, but they somehow have to share, to feel like they belong to the same social category, right? And they have to kind of internalize the social identity that comes along with that. So there's some kind of attachment to the social identity and some kind of emotional attachment to being a member of this social category, this group, okay? So there's something where you can kind of from the outset just like, oh, 1, 2, 3 people, okay, that's a group, but there's also something psychological about it, that these people feel like they belong to the same social category and they have at least a minimum of emotional attachment to these. I think if you think about like a take-home message, right? If you think about like, okay, at the end of this lecture, what should I take away? How does intergroup behavior, how does in-group versus out-group behavior, us versus them, as just like in a popular media probably often is most often portrayed, then if there's one kind of upshot, then I think these 2 cartoons really neatly summarize it. Here on the left, I kind of let that tweet in. I saw this from this tweet where somebody says like probably could be the best cartoon ever, right? And I agree, it's a really good cartoon that captures a lot of essence. Here you can see underneath these 2 armies that face off each other, it says there can be no peace until they renounce their rabbit god and accept our dark god, right? And so this is like the why is it funny? It's always good if you have to explain a joke, but why is this kind of like feels like an arbitrary distinction? Because the flags they both carry are the same, just one of them look and see a duck and the other group looks at it and thinks this is a rabbit. So often kind of even if we're based on really arbitrary distinctions between, we feel they are stupid and we are good, right? And just because I see when I look at that flag, or the people of my group think that is a duck and that is a rabbit, and that is actually closer to the truth than one might suspect from research in social psychology. It doesn't take a lot for us to believe that our group, as arbitrary as it could be, is better than the other group. I think on the right side here you see it a little bit more distinct, right? You have certain elements. I think there's on the left there's a tower, on the right there's a tower, on the left there's a church, on the right there's a church, and you think like, oh, this is our great religion and this is their primitive superstition. I think if you're looking from the outside in, or from afar, from if you consider the conflict between 2 groups and you're not a member of each of these groups, you always think like, this is quite bizarre. They're so similar. Why are they fighting? They're basically believing the same thing. They behave the same thing and so forth. And yet for these 2 groups, it makes perfectly sense that the same thing, when it belongs to us, can be our heroic adventures and adventurers. But if it's from them, then these are their brutish invaders. Okay? And that's kind of like in some ways, the summary, the upshot of a lot of research into group behavior. I want to kind of frame it a little bit as the tale of 2 studies. I want to talk about in the beginning about the Stanford prison experiment. I bet most of you are familiar with the Stanford prison experiment. It's one of the most popular, famous psychology studies. It's like if you would think about something that Hollywood thinks of psychological research, if you would think about like making almost like a Hollywood approach to studies, then this is the study, right? And I think and it is started as an idea to measure or manipulate and understand exactly what we are interested in, trying to understand what it means if you take people randomly, assign them to one group to another, what happens to them. It's really important, and I'll say this in the beginning, that this whole study is a fraud, and there's little to be learned about that. But it's important for me to kind of highlight that. I even meet sometimes students in third year or so forth who try to argue things based on the Stanford prison experiment, even though this is a scientific fraud and we should just ignore it. But it's just important to know as a psychologist. We shortly talk about that, and then we talk about, in some ways, like the opposite. Really boring, almost boring experimental paradigm, and it's the minimal group paradigm. Yet the findings and the results this paradigm produced are absolutely spectacular, and they are the kind of key paradigm that helps us to understand how selecting or being separated in us and them impacts our whole psychological processes, apparatus. And I think this is like the large part of the lecture today. We focus on minimal group paradigm. Okay, so we do just these two things that we just kind of outlined first, and then in the additional videos we will talk about group conflict. This is like when groups are in conflict. It's kind of like an amplifier of a lot of the processes we will talk about in chapter 2. What does it do to us? How can we understand group conflict? What is group conflict actually about? And then in the last additional video, we will talk about basically when a conflict is there, when people hate each other because they belong to different groups. How can we overcome that? We will talk about the contact hypothesis and some kind of fun studies that help us to better understand that. We will look in chapter 3 and chapter 4 at another really famous study that's Sharif's, I think it's caves versus robbers study, and kind of help us understand how this helps us to better learn about how group conflict works and what we can do in order to resolve this. Okay. So let's start with the Stanford prison experiments, guards versus prisoners. I think most of you kind of at least have a vague understanding of what happened in the study. Let me just kind of remind you quickly what this study was all about. So if you would be a participant in the study, if you signed up on Sona, then at the morning of the experiment, the police would have stopped in front of your house. They would have gotten you out, and they would say like, oh, you're assigned in this experiment as a prisoner. The people who would put you on the car, who would bring you to this basement in Stanford University would be the participants that would be the guards. They would wear a uniform, and you would be put on something specific. Your neighbors, wherever you live, would see that the police supposedly picked you up. And I think there's, okay, somebody raised their hand.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. Was the study of the design to study group behavior? Like, why would he come? What gave him the inspiration for this study?
Yes, I say that in a second, but it's a good question, right? So the idea here, let me first finish that and then come back to that. But thanks for the question, really appreciate it. So maybe it would have been better to kind of start with that. The idea here was to what Zimbardo and his colleagues were really interested in. They thought, what happens if I randomly assign people to be either the like either in a group of the guards or the prisoners, right? And at that time, you have to kind of, we come back to that a little bit later. At that time, there was this kind of discussion going on in California about prison reform. I think it's still ongoing. Not much has happened, but sometimes people would say like, oh, these prisoners, they're like bad people. That's why we have to treat them like that. And the guards, some would say like, oh, like, why do guards so often misbehave? What are the reasons for that? And one of the real drivers ideologically for Zimbardo was to show that being in a prison system, and just taking on the role transforms you as a person. You want to know what happens if I turn you into a prisoner versus a god. That was a great question. I probably should have started with that. So I kind of assumed, I think that I assumed that everyone kind of knows this study, but not everyone had psychology in the A levels. So sorry for that, and great question. So then what happened is that basically they brought them, the prisoners who were participants were brought into this basement by guards who were also participants in the study, and they were told, I think the experiment was supposed to run 2 weeks. So Zimbardo, there was each of them were paid pretty nicely. Obviously, if you're like 24-hour participation, you need a little bit more than some credits on Sona. So they were paid really nicely, both of these groups. And what happened is that the situation between these guards and the prisoners really quickly escalated. There were kind of protests staged, I think, already on day 2 by the prisoners. They wanted to improve their conditions. They wanted to they started hunger strikes. They started to reject cooperation. But most of it, what happens, and I think what is most often when we think about the Stanford prison experiment, and you can see the picture here where somebody has the paperback on their hat, and there's the guard with the sunglasses on with his uniform, another participant who's kind of pushing this other person. You can see that the guards got really kind of threatening, almost sadistic. They really enjoyed, it seems, seemingly mistreating these participants. Yes. So they were like supposedly really sorry, I just read it in the chat. I should never do that. I should just ignore it. But it's like you can see that I think in at day 4 or 5, Zimbardo on his girlfriend at that time comes into the basement, sees what is happening, and she says, we have to immediately stop this before something really terrible happens here. These guards are really losing it, and they start to really badly treat the prisoners. So there's this idea, right, that basically these Stanford students who were, as Yasmin said in the chat, who were all male, they're all white, they're all from the same background. They thought like, oh, wow, they will not kill each other, but they will do something terrible to each other if we do not stop that. So part of this is like, why? I mean, obviously, this is like, I think Zimbardo was very aware that this experiment had a lot of publicity potential. Parts of this were filmed. Everything was audio recorded. You can see in the background some pictures of, there's a movie and a TV show about that where they try to recreate it. So despite the many problems attached to this study, this is often taken as the prime example when we talk about prison reform, when we talk about bigger things, why people, normal people, do awful things. It's like, oh, we know this from the Stanford prison study, that if I give somebody a uniform and say, here you have some power over another group, or you're in charge of this group over that other group, then we will behave terribly. So this is kind of like how Zimbardo here in the left corner summarized that the mere fact of putting on uniforms was sufficient to transform participants into passive prisoners and aggressive guards. Okay? Each subject's prior societal learning of the meaning of prisons and the behavior scripts associated with the oppositional roles of prisoners and guards was the sole source of guidance. So this is really important, because what he says is like, all we did is basically convince people, you're now a prisoner and you're now God. And then everything else that happened thereafter, especially the maltreatment of the guards towards the prisoners, was nothing that we told them. So they just almost automatically unrolled. And so the idea is basically, if I would separate you guys into 2 groups, and what you call one of you prisoners and one of you guards, at day 2, what would happen from everything you have learned, the social learning learning about what it means to be a guard and what it means to be a prisoner, you would start the guards would start to treat, actively mistreat the prisoners, and the prisoners would be kind of passive and would be be under the influence of that. That was like his theory. It's basically all it took, and this is what he sold the study for years and years and decades, that this is what it shows us. It's basically once you slip on a certain social identity, you become that person, and the bad things you have learned about what it means to be a guard or what it means to be a prisoner will automatically become your part of your identity, part of yourself. There are many problems with that study, but I just want to highlight like these two key ideas, right? And then it's basically that there was not more guidance. Yes, so I think, okay, ethics committee, was that approved by the ethics committee? Is a really good question. Yes, the study was yes, so yes, I think there's, I'm talking about this now. So the study was approved by the ethics committee, but this is like, I think you have to kind of remember at that time, a lot of bad stuff happened in science. So a lot of these kind of like in psychology, the study we talk about next week and this study, Milgram's study, and the study here, the Zimbardo study, led people to think about, maybe we should also think about ethics within the, yes, I think yes. Thanks, Yasmin. That at that time, yes, that's a good point. Like in the 70s, late 60s of the last century, that there were like people would experiment on people, medical experiments without telling them. Informed consent was not something that was a standard practice in the 70s at that time. Part of that, I mean, there were studies in the kind of like in the medical field, but part of that was that we understood at some point, oh, we can't just trust the experimenter to have the best interest of the participants at their heart. And this is kind of like, so there wasn't really that much of an ethics committee at that time. So this is basically something like you can even read write-ups today if the journalist is particularly lazy, that kind of rehash that is like, oh, this is what we learned from that study. So this is also, it's like one thing is kind of weird about the study is like it was published in Naval Research Review. So in a study about basically about like nautical adventures. I'm not sure why, but it's like obviously because there were so many problems with the study that psychological journals would have a real problem publishing that. And not so much about the ethics, but that's kind of, people didn't have that much problems with ethics, but it's really hard to kind of understand what the results are, what we're finding here. It is more an account, but he just wanted to have it out, and so that he can start talking about this publicly and use it for his campaign. Okay. I mean, there's a controversy, which is like, I think both of the comments that I got here about like, wasn't it a bias study, and wasn't there some problems with the ethics? This is like, even if you look at this in Wikipedia, you see there's a ethical debate, there's a scientific rigor debate, and it never has been replicated. The other thing, which is kind of like, which like recently kind of, I think when 1 year or 2 years ago, it really blew up again, because what happened is that his audio recordings of the study, so everything was audio recorded, all the conversations. I think it was a French philosopher actually who went through them and discovered how many things that Zimbardo said were actually a lie. So that, and I will try kind of highlight two of them, but there are many, many more. Okay. And the idea is here basically that it was not the prisoners that just kind of started to act up and passively kind of broke down as a result of being a prisoner. No, that there was more to that. And especially that the acting of the guards was something that he tried to, or he initiated and directed. So he would say like, oh, the gods were simply told that they were going to go into a situation. They made up their own rules for maintaining law, order, and respect, right? This is what he told in a congressional hearing. You can see basically how influential that study was. But this is wrong, right? So here's like one of his grad students, Jaffe, he was basically the lead guard, and he was really invested in this idea that, we have to show how terrible it is that if people become gods, how badly they treat how badly they treat prisoners in order to stimulate, in order to invigorate this prison reform, right? So he had a clear kind of sense of what they want to do. He was also very well versed, and because he studied that, in trying to, in these tactics of how you can manipulate other people, how manipulation in prisons works, and so forth. And he repeatedly, here's an excerpt that you can read for yourself, but he repeatedly told the guards that you have to become tougher. He would make recommendations about tactics, about manipulations, and he would basically become the leader of this guard of groups and tell them what they should do in order. And this is, I think, in one of the articles that kind of reinterprets the finding of the Zimbardo studies. They highlight that, which is on Moodle. They say like it's almost like he's the charismatic leader that leads the guards in order to kind of progress better science, in order to have society progress. We have to be kind of, for 24 hours or 48 hours, real assholes. We have to lie and betray science, but this will have a greater purpose. And this is what happens there. He would, like in these audio recordings, you can often see that he basically stimulates them to do certain things, and that they have to be tougher. You have to be a tough guard. You can't be nice, and so forth. Okay. So there's this idea out there that the guards have to, and they're guided. Zimbardo does also often intervene and tell them, oh, this would be a good idea. Why don't you do this? Or why don't you do that? Okay. And so the other thing is kind of like the spontaneous revolt, right? He would say like, oh, there's like, without any reasons, the prisoners started to revolt. I have like quotation marks around this because this is what he said, that it's like, oh, just spontaneously people did that. But it's actually what happens. What happened is that these students there were a lot of students who came in who wanted to use these 2 weeks as a kind of intense exam preparation period. They thought like, I can just go in there. Nobody can hold me back. There's nothing. You can't just take somebody hostage. And then on the second day, Zimbardo basically told them that they can't leave. And so this is when the revolts are starting, when you're kind of saying, I need to get out here. I need to get out here. I can't. I have exams coming up. I don't want to be here. I want to leave. And so like this person here is like, oh, in the beginning, it was a great time. We had fun. We knew these are just like other kind of Stanford kids just like us, and that there was nothing happening. But then they kind of learned that they can't leave. Zimbardo told them they can't leave. When Zimbardo was confronted with that, you can see that at the very bottom of the slide. He says like, it's a lie, it's a lie. But then unfortunately, he audio recorded himself. Uppsala, this is like, oh, okay, I don't have it on the slide here, but then actually on the audio recording, I think it's in the notes. If you look into the notes of the slide, you can see that he actually told them that. He discusses this with his group of guards and says like, okay, they have like these daily meetings where they kind of discuss what's going on and how they can basically process or progress the desired results a little bit further. And then he says, oh, I told them they can't leave. I told them whatever they do, they're here in a study, they can't leave till the study is over. And that's when the revolt kicked in. So I think for you guys, the one key thing is to take in mind, yes, there are like shambolic ethics involved in the study, but it's much more about that. It's about basically that there's like Zimbardo and one of his graduate students trying to push a certain type of results in order to get a certain type of effect. Of them, they might have meant well, they might have wanted, they had good intentions, but I think for scientific purposes, we can't really learn anything from the study. It was never replicated. And I doubt if I would do that to you guys, that you would start to torture each other. This is not what kind of like the research we will talk about in a minute shows us. It's just really important for me that you kind of know, okay, this study is a scientific fraud. So let me kind of, okay. So let's talk about like a different, all right, Louis, do you want to just ask something?
Yeah, what do you mean by scientific fraud? Because wasn't it relatively reliable considering they were made to believe that they could leave, but they weren't allowed to leave? How could it be? It kind of recreates realistic conditions in prisons whereby prisoners aren't allowed to do it. They're restricted to their freedom, and guards take advantage of that, resulting in uh, what you have today. So,
So
although
I
it was
think
definitely unethical,
yeah.
yeah,
So what I mean by that is like if I lock you in a room and say you're not allowed to leave, then you might feel like you're in hostage, right? Which is not what it's a very different than if you commit a crime and you're sentenced to go um, into jail. I think it's really important to kind of not mistake validity with reliability, because what you're talking about isn't that in some kind of like ecological validity? You're in a jail, you can't leave, right? But if you're told something differently and then this changes, that sets, and then there's because the key thing is here, right? Is that he would say, that Zimbardo would say, oh look, these prisoners, they spontaneously revolted. There was no reason for them. Why did they revolt? Oh, just because they're prisoner, and if you're a prisoner, you have to do a revolt. But what the real reason why they revolted is because he told them you can't leave. Whatever you do, you can't leave. Right? So there's a real difference. The other one, why I think it's a scientific fraud, is because it was often taken, as you interpret it, as kind of seeing, okay, this is what prison does to guards. But it's not what happened. Nothing basically happened for a while till Zimbardo intervened, till his graduate student intervened and pushed them and said like, oh, you have to do this, you have to get tougher. Why don't you try this? Why don't you try that, right? And then they did it and things escalated. But that's not what the study is about. I hope this makes sense,
yeah,
okay?
thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So let's look at the kind of like at the different different study, the minimal group paradigm. Okay, in the second half of this lecture. So we kind of know that these spectacular attempts to study group behavior, they, in some ways, they were motivated by, I think, a really good assumption, right? You think like, oh, how can I understand group behavior? It involves so much. It involves some social learning. It involves conflict. It involves kind of zero-sum games. If I do this, you get less, I get more, and so forth. There's so, if you think about how men and women interact, how other groups like ethical, racial minorities and majorities interact, there's so much at stake historically and research-wise. How can we study that, right? And so what the idea here was from the kind of minimal group paradigm is like, why don't we start with one paradigm that strips it all away? And if we do so, we create kind of like a social vacuum, okay? So now we know it can't be about the social learning. It can't be about anything else. And once we have that established, we can kind of sprinkle on top the conflict, the roles, kind of figure out, does it matter whether I wear a uniform or not, whether I wear a badge that identifies me or not, and so forth. What if we basically reduce everything, take everything away that has nothing to do with group conflict, and thereby we have a control condition, okay? So this was the idea, which then basically become here, as you can see in one of, like in the paper that I uploaded, which is really good, which is just called Mere Membership here by Dunham, Yarof Dunham. But the other one is from Jay Van Bavels and Dominic Packer's recent book about the power of us, which is kind of like a popular science write-up about all of these kind of like the powerful effects that in us versus them has on us. But this was basically, it became the most famous control condition, but this was the idea. So what did Tajwell, who a British psychologist who did that, what did he do in his studies? Okay, as I said, these studies are basically the opposite in some ways of what you would expect from group behavior studies once you're familiar with the Zimbardo, right? Here he just invited participants, often university students, to come to the lab, and then they would have to decide, for instance, in one of the most famous ones, which is still used today, you will see a bunch of pictures. These are by Kandinsky and Clay. So Clay would be on the right, Kandinsky would be on the left. So if you like pictures on the right a little bit more than pictures on the left, then you would kind of rate them a little bit higher than the pictures on the left. And then you would, I would tell you, oh, you're in a Paul Clay group or you are in the Kandinsky group, okay? Our results basically tell us that you're a Kandinsky lover or a Clay lover. Okay, so this is just like we created on a kind of arbitrary criterion division between these two groups. Okay, there's another one. So this is the whole idea of a minimal group paradigm. There's another one which I show you. I think show you on the next slide where you kind of see these dots, and then you ask, okay, tell me how many dots do you see? All right. And then people would say, like, I don't know, I saw 15, I saw 12. And then you would use, oh, you're the overestimators or the underestimators, right? Based on kind of how much you're a dot overestimator or you're a dot underestimator. There are other kind of for minimal group paradigms to be a true minimal group paradigm. There are other conditions that have to be in place. So there's no face-to-face contact. So if I would invite, if like basically you guys, into a study, you would all come at different times, staggered. You would not interact with each other. You wouldn't know who the other person is that is in your group with all the overestimators or underestimators or all the Clay lovers versus Kandinsky lovers. You wouldn't know anything about the other person. There was complete anonymity. And so this is like, I'll explain this in a second in a little bit more detail, but it's not zero sum. What I mean by that is like basically if I share resources with my in-group, it doesn't affect how much the out-group get and vice versa. So if I'm nice to the out-group, then this will not negatively impact how few or the resources for my in-group, okay? So there's no conflict, there's no competition about resources between these groups, okay? And this is basically, it's kind of like a social vacuum. Anything that we can say about these two groups is we don't know each other. It's kind of an arbitrary criteria we use to differentiate between one group and the other group. And my behavior does not negatively impact, like if I'm nice to the out group, this has not a negative impact on the in group, right? And so this is kind of like where we stripped everything away. So in the first study that Tajwal did, the people then, you could be overestimator, underestimator, or Paul Clay and Kandinsky lover. What they got these booklets, and now they had to decide how to, and let me just activate my pen here, how to give out rewards, right? So you can see you're either in a Clay group or in a Kandinsky group. So if you're in this is like booklet for group preferring Clay. So we are Clay lovers according to this arbitrary test in the beginning. And then you would say like, okay, you have to take a row. Okay, so I could, for instance, say, okay, I could take 13, 13. This would be like we both get the same, or I could get 25, 19. So here you would basically, we would get, if we're all in a Clay group, we would get 25 and 19. So they had to make a series of these decisions. And what you can see here basically is this kind of different patterns that you can use, okay? So you could emphasize fairness. This would be where somebody is like 17 and 17, okay? You could look at what's called the maximum joint profit. You can look at if the two of these are is a relatively uncommon choice, but if I combine all of these points, we get the most. So if you're interested in kind of maximizing utility, then you would do that. You can basically look at the maximum for your in-group profit. So here you would just look like, okay, what is the highest I can get? 23, and I don't really care whatever happens to the out-group. Or you can kind of have a composite of that. You could, for instance, I think we come back to that, but you could a little bit later, you can also look at where do I get the most but then also the outgroup gets the least. Okay, so by going through these answers, I can see how much and in which way you favor your in-group over your outgroup. And remember that in this study, this was basically done to show that there's no, with all of these things, the idea was that there's no favoritism going on. But what you find here basically is, like, if you kind of look at the results of that 72% of the participants favored their own group. So even though it didn't kind of give them any advantages, they could get the same amount of coins if they did not favor their own group. So there was right, it's not a zero-sum game, but you can see that 72% of the people in a clay group favored their own group, though they gave their own group more rewards than their other group. Okay, so well, why is this so famous, right? You kind of think, oh, I don't really get it, right? The key thing to take away from this is that even if I just arbitrarily put you in two groups that have no social learning history, that have nothing in common, that did not even interact, there is no advantage of being mean to the outgroup. And still what you can see is this in-group bias. So even if we strip everything away that we thought creates an in-group bias over an out-group bias, then what we can see here in these results is that we don't need that. For certain outcomes, we don't really need anything but just it's us versus them. And it's just us and them. It's not even versus them because there is no competition between these two groups. Okay. So this, for many reasons, really kind of stimulated research on the in-group and out-group, like in-group bias. This is what we can see here. I think is a really important term. Let's just pause a moment and highlight that. In-group bias means just simply that you prefer on some kind of measure the in-group over the out-group. Often this is just like preferring my group over the other and not so much about what's called here out-group denigration or out-group hate. Okay, most often I just simply want my group to be treated better than the other group. And so one thing that from early on is like, okay, how early in life does that start? If we really think about if that can kind of explain a lot of the behavior that we can see when we look at intergroup behavior, when we look at how our society works, then how early does that start? So this is a study that was done with 3 to 4 year olds. So they would come in, they would pick one of these balls. So they would just go into the urn and like pick a ball and it's like, oh, you're in a green group or you're in a yellow group, right? So they don't even do anything in kind of like, oh, do you like green better than orange or anything like that? No, they just pick one ball and that makes them participate or be a member of a certain group, either the green or the orange group, right? And then after they give them, they measure the explicit attitude. So what they do in a study with 3 to 4 year olds, they show them 2 pictures. One of the pictures is another member of the green group, and in the other one is like a member of the orange group. Let's assume that the green group would be the in group and the orange group would be the out group. And now it's like, whom of these 2 do you like more? And so they do this, and you can see about in 60% of the cases, they prefer their own group over the kids from their own group over the other group. And then they also think immediately that the members of this other group share their preferences, right? So this is 3 to 4 year olds. And what you can see here is like, so you see 2 pictures in these studies. What they do is like they show them, for instance, can't quite remember what the preferences were, but let's imagine they would give them, the children, something like, do you like spaghetti or do you like penne? What type of noodles do you like? What type of pasta do you like? And so you would say, I would say in this case, spaghetti. And then you're just like, okay, the other members of your group, do you think they like spaghetti or penne? Okay, and you can see that this bias also emerges. So this is in children with 3 to 4 years old. They already seem to immediately, like, if you're in my group, I like you better, and I think we share something in common, even though on this kind of minimal group, right? Without any social learning history, without any kind of interactions between these groups, without knowing the children in the other group. right? So it seems like that we are prone, the moment we know, oh, this is our group, this is their group, that we like our group better than the other group. We kind of think of the group as sharing something that makes us a group, even though in this case, right, if you just pull a ball out of the urn, that should not be the case. Okay, so this is another study just to kind of highlight you quickly a little bit. Like if you think about like, okay, how can we use that to kind of understand a little bit better, like when the group collides with the self, right? So let's say you have a certain aspect of your identity and you this collides a little bit with your favoritism of your in-group over the out-group. So let me explain what I mean by that. This is the so-called, this is one of the sliders from the social orientation matrix. So you can basically figure out by asking people how they would distribute hypothetical or real money among themselves and another person. So this has nothing to do with groups for the moment. I just want to basically measure if you're a pro-social person or you're not a pro-social person. So if you kind of look at the first one here, you would say like, what would the pro-social person pick? They would pick this 85-85, right? So they would pick the fair solution, but also the one where the other group, the other person gets the most, right? There are two other kind of patterns that you can see that people choose. So there's these are the pro-social people, right? Who always look to kind of have a fair outcome where the other person is not worse off than myself. There are two other types of people. There are those who are basically pro-self. They just look in the rows of the outcomes they get for themselves, and it's like, oh, this is the highest for myself. I picked this. I don't care how much the other person gets. And there are what's called the competitors. These would say like, I take the 85, but I can see the difference between these two is the biggest. So I get off the best, okay? So for the purpose of these studies, these two categories were just kind of summarized as the pro-self, and people who would give answers like these, they became pro-social. Okay, so now they want to know what happens if my kind of pro-social or pro-self identity clashes with my group, right? What if I am pro-self, but now I have to kind of share something with my group? So what they did in the study, they kind of, sometimes they activated and sometimes they did not activate the group identity, okay? So in a high group identification, they were told that the purpose study of the study was to compare contribution decisions of students' groups at Southampton University, so more or less around the corner, with those of student groups at other participating universities. So this is now, how do we as a group, as students at City or at Southampton do compared to another group? And if in a low group identification condition, they just told them this is to compare individuals and not groups. So what can we see when they're now asked to distribute real resources in these studies? And what you can see is here basically for the pro-socials, if we look at this first, right, it's exactly what you would suspect. It doesn't really matter whether they're in the low or in the high identification condition. You can see that they contribute to the bigger, like the social pot a lot. Okay, so this is basically here the percent of contributions to the common good. And if I'm pro-self, obviously I am inclined to give to others under which conditions. So even if it's kind of like, if it's in line with my group identification, great. If it's not, if it's just in line with what I do, then this should not make a difference. But what you can see here is really interesting when you look at the pro-selves, because now if you activate the group identity, suddenly the pro-self become really pro-social. Right? So you can see they're a little bit less than the pro-socials, right? But it's a dramatic difference. Just when you make them kind of aware that this is about their group, right? They become extremely cooperative towards their own group. So here it seems like that often, at least in these studies and other situations, that our group identity, when activated, when we're aware of it, when we're reminded of it, becomes more important than who we are as a person. So often our group identity overrules our self-identity, especially in social situations. I'm not showing you some of the studies here, but I just want to kind of like put that in here. Part of this, how strong you show these effects, is how strongly you identify with the group. So the stronger you feel like I'm a Southampton student, a Southampton University student, the more you will show these effects of group identity manipulation. This is just like the single item measure of social identification. I identify with my group, but you can measure these differently. But it matters how strongly you are attached to that group. Okay, so surprisingly, I'm like a little bit short of time. That's so not my style. I just want to kind of highlight this a little bit here, and then we'll see, maybe I record another short video about why we see these. But this is only the effects we can find in minimal group studies. Okay, if I use a minimal group and then use these things that you see here, and you will see more in a second, as dependent variable, you can see effects of minimal groups on all of these. I just want to highlight two here: positive explicit and positive implicit attitudes. Okay, so we often think about implicit and explicit attitudes as these hallmarks of racism, and when we think, for instance, about racism, we think about history, social learning, conflict, etc. But you can, even without any of these, you can produce just by sorting people in two minimal groups, Clay versus Kandinsky, you can suddenly see that they have a preference for the in-group over the out-group. Okay, this is like, you can hear, I think there are really interesting studies about empathy for pain and greater emotional empathy. So the moment I'm in a minimal group, I feel like I feel more your pain, right? And I feel less the pain of my out group, right? So these are often the evaluative effects. Most people, when we talk about in-group bias, we think about these kind of effects here. This is like the key. But you can see that other effects can be observed. We had this kind of like, this is what Dunham summarized as coalitional effects. But this is like these favoritism that we saw of costly giving, of non-costly giving, of giving other people, etc. Okay, only with these groups, right? You don't need much more. It's not that, I don't know, like there's like, oh, if men need to progress in this institution more than women, we need to keep the women down, hence we shouldn't give them the opportunities we give to men. You can see the same behavior if it's just a kind of like meaningless, pointless, minimal group. Learning effects, I think this is like better trust. So if you would be my group, I would trust your testimony more. We have, when we talk about this, like better face memory, I think we would talk about this in a second, and then we end this there. And you can see there's some of the things we think of like hallmarks of racism, of prejudice, of stereotypes, of sexism. You don't need any of that to produce these kind of in-group, out-group effects. Okay, so these are just like to kind of give you a feeling like how many effects you get on the brain, on the behavior, on the emotional, on the cognitive level, just by sorting people in these arbitrary groups. So the kind of troubling implication is that basically the moment I get myself, whether I kind of want to or not, it kind of gets sorted in one of these two groups: men versus women, husband versus wife, expert versus non-expert, German versus non-German, Liverpool fan versus non-Liverpool, and so forth. The moment I kind of am aware that I'm a member of that group, I will have a negative or like a positive bias towards my own group. Okay, it's most often what we find is basically in-group love and not so much out-group hate. I would just not care much about the people in out-group, but care very much about the people in my group. I think, so let's kind of like, because we're almost done here, right? And I think I will just kind of highlight two questions, and then I will record a short video on what it explains and kind of Tajval's original ideas. But the interesting thing is what we can find in these minimal paradigms without doing anything crazy. So here's like one thing that's like one of the, when we talk about racism, then the kind of like what's called the own group own race bias, that I remember faces for, oh no, this is like, oh sorry, this is on the next slide, I messed this up. So this is like one of the studies where they kind of show like, oh, why do people react so aggressively or trying towards young angry black men? That was kind of like the key idea of the study. And what they did is like in a kind of clever manipulation, they showed people either smiling or faces or aggressive faces of mixed race people, men, okay? So you would either see a smiling mixed race person or an aggressively looking mixed race person. And now your job was to say whether they're white or black. Are they part of your in-group or your out-group, right? And what they find basically in these studies is that, oh, here's like the level of implicit prejudice, right? What we talked about last week, the IAT. If you have a strong negative attitude towards African Americans, then the moment you see an angry face, you're more likely to think that this is a black person rather than a white person, and this is not really part of when you see happy faces. So you're perfectly fine of kind of categorizing happy faces as either or, but the moment somebody gets aggressive, they're part of the out group, not the in group, right? And this is like one idea where really rich explanations have been kind of social learning on media portraits and all of that, where they try to explain that. But here you can see, and I think this is the last thing I say today, you can reproduce that with minimal groups. And I just want to kind of like, I will not explain that study in detail because we run out of time, but you can see the effect is a little bit weaker. But if you do the same thing with minimal groups, you can see that the same thing happens, right? That people are more likely to categorize angry faces into the out group than the in group. And even that this kind of corresponds to their implicit bias, right? So the stronger their implicit bias in favor of the in-group over the out-group is, the more likely they will do that, right? So you can reproduce the same effect in a minimal group that we thought is kind of the result of historical and media portray for that kind of roots back to maybe 200, 300, 400, 500 years. You can reproduce the same finding to a lesser extent in a minimal group paradigm, which really shows you how little often is needed in order to kind of reproduce these group effects. The same with like you can do with remembering and recognizing people from your in-group, your out-group. This is another one where it works as well with minimal group designs as it works with real groups designs. Okay, I will stop here. And I think, yes, we're like 1 minute to go, and I will stop the recording here and we'll add the last 3 slides that I didn't get to as another additional video today or tomorrow. Okay.